There were 4,000 motorcycles in Hollister, California on the 4th of July weekend, 1947. They were spread across a valley town of 4,500 people, a place that had been hosting motorcycle races since the 1930s. The San Benito County Fairgrounds had organized racing that weekend. The Salinas Ramblers held a gymkhana. Riders from across California came for the bikes, for the racing, for the company of people who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere under your own power on a machine you had built yourself. By Monday morning, Life magazine had turned it into a national scandal. One photograph. Staged. A man named Eddie Davenport, not a violent outlaw, but a regular rider, was asked to sit on a borrowed motorcycle surrounded by empty beer bottles that had been collected from the surrounding area and arranged in the frame by a photographer named Barney Peterson. Davenport was paid for his participation. The motorcycle was not his. The beer bottles were collected from a gutter. They were not placed there by Davenport. The caption read, "Motorcyclists take over town." America believed it. Hollywood confirmed it. And the culture that had existed for 40 years before that photograph, the actual motorcycle culture of the 1940s and the 1950s, the veterans and the working men and the women who rode because they loved it, and the clubs that organized racing and safety and community events across the country, that culture was buried under a myth that Hollywood invented, and the industry spent the next 70 years selling back to the people it had destroyed. To understand what the 1950s motorcycle culture actually was, you have to understand what preceded it. And what preceded it was 40 years of working Americans falling in love with the motorcycle as the most democratic machine ever built. The Indian Motorcycle Company was founded in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1901. Harley-Davidson followed in Milwaukee in 1903. By 1910, there were dozens of American motorcycle manufacturers competing for the attention of a public that had discovered a machine that could cover ground faster than a horse, required less maintenance than a car, and could be purchased by a working man who could not yet afford four wheels. By 1920, the American Motorcyclists Association had been established to sanction racing, organize clubs, and build the institutional framework for a culture that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The association's membership through the 1920s and the 1930s was working class in the truest sense of the word. Farmers, factory workers, miners, postal workers, delivery men. Men for whom the motorcycle was not a leisure product, but a practical machine that happened to produce joy in the using of it. Women rode too, before anyone called it remarkable. Effie Hotchkiss rode a motorcycle across America in 1915 from New York to San Francisco and back with her mother in the sidecar. She was 26 years old. She did not have GPS. She did not have paved roads for most of the route. She had a Harley-Davidson, a sidecar, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided to do something and was not interested in the reasons it could not be done. In 1916, Sisters Augusta and Adeline Van Buren became the first women to ride motorcycles across America. The American Motorcyclists Association refused to certify them because the certification was for men only. They went anyway. They arrived on the West Coast and applied to join the Army as dispatch riders. The Army refused. They went home. For the next 40 years, nobody in American popular culture talked about them. The motorcycle community of the 1920s and 1930s was not an outlaw culture. It was a community culture. The AMA organized gypsy tours, group rides to specific destinations that created a social infrastructure around the machine. Local clubs held hill climbs, flat track races, and endurance events. Riders competed for trophies rather than territory. The social events were family events, picnics, barbecues, camping trips, organized around the machine that everyone in the group owned, loved, and maintained. The men who came back from World War II came back different. They had been 18 or 20 when they left, and 30 or 35 when they returned. They had been to places they could not describe and done things they could not talk about. They came home to a country that wanted to pretend the war had not happened the way it had, that wanted normalcy and conformity and the suburban dream as a replacement for the chaos of the preceding decade. Some of them could not do it, not because they were dangerous, but because they had been somewhere that normal life could not reach. The motorcycle was the only piece of equipment available that produced a sensation close to what they were missing: the speed, the exposure to weather and road. The mechanical intimacy of a machine that responded directly to every decision the rider made. The community of other men who had also been somewhere that the civilian world did not fully understand. They formed clubs, the booze fighters, the pissed off bastards of Bloomington, the Market Street Commandos. These names sound menacing to 2026 ears. In 1946, they were ironic, the self-deprecating humor of men who had survived something and needed a name for the group that shared the survival. Most of these clubs were not outlaw organizations. They were veteran organizations that rode motorcycles. The gypsy tours, the hill climbs, the flat track events, the AMA calendar of sanctioned activities. That was the frame most of these clubs operated within, the same frame that had defined American motorcycle culture for 20 years before the war. July 4th weekend, 1947. The Salinas Ramblers Motorcycle Club had organized the AMA sanctioned gypsy tour to Hollister, California. The San Benito County Fairgrounds had racing on the schedule. The town had hosted motorcycle events for years without incident. The numbers vary by source. Roughly 4,000 riders came. A town of 4,500 people suddenly had its population nearly doubled by visitors arriving on motorcycles. Most of them were there for the racing. Some of them were there for the beer. A small number of them were not affiliated with any club and were not interested in the scheduled activities. There were incidents, minor property damage, some public drunkenness, a few fistfights. The Hollister City Jail, which had a capacity of 10, was stretched. The local police were overwhelmed not because the riders were violent, but because 4,000 unexpected visitors to a town of 4,500 produces logistical challenges that no small-town police department had been designed to manage. The San Francisco Chronicle sent a reporter. The reporter sent a dispatch that described events in terms significantly more dramatic than what the Hollister chief of police would later characterize as just one hell of a big party. The Associated Press picked up the story. Life magazine sent Barney Peterson to get a photograph. What Peterson found when he arrived was not a town under siege. It was a party that had gotten loud. The street was littered with beer bottles, the residue of 4,000 people spending a holiday weekend in a small town. There was no organized violence. There were no weapons. There was noise and mess and the specific chaos of a large gathering in a small place that had not been designed for it. Peterson needed a photograph that told the story the wire service had already filed. He found Eddie Davenport, a 29-year-old rider from Riverside who was willing to sit on a borrowed motorcycle. The beer bottles from the surrounding area were collected and arranged around the motorcycle. Davenport was told to look disheveled and hold a beer. Peterson took the photograph. The caption that ran in Life magazine read, "Motorcyclists take over town." The country that had just survived World War II and was deeply anxious about what the returning veterans had brought back with them, looked at that photograph and saw confirmation of its deepest fear. They believed the men who had come home were not entirely civilized. The motorcycle was the vehicle of their UN civilization. The town of Hollister was the first casualty. Every word of that interpretation was wrong. The photograph was staged. The caption was fabricated. The veterans who came to Hollister came for a race, drank beer at a party, and went home. The chief of police said so. The city records said so. Actual contemporary accounts from Hollister residents said so. Nobody was listening. Hollywood was already writing the script. Before we go further, if you are watching this and you know someone who has been riding for 30 years and thinks they know where motorcycle culture came from, send them this video right now. Not later. Right now. The story we are telling about where the outlaw biker myth actually came from has never been told at this depth on YouTube. The person who shares it first is doing the riding community a genuine service. Share it to your Facebook groups. Post it in your motorcycle subreddits. Text it to the riders you know. The history that gets covered up stays covered up until someone decides to share the accurate version. The Wild One, directed by Laszlo Benedek, produced by Stanley Kramer, starring Marlon Brando as Johnny, the leader of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, and Lee Marvin as Chino, the leader of the rival Beatles. The film was released December 30th, 1953. It was based loosely on a short story by Frank Rooney called The Cyclist Raid, which was itself based loosely on the Hollister incident. The distance between what actually happened at Hollister and what appears in The Wild One is the distance between a loud party and a siege. The Wild One was a work of fiction presented as a window into reality. The opening title card set the tone. It read, "This is a shocking story. It could never take place in most American towns, but it did in this one." The film that followed showed motorcycle riders terrorizing a small town, assaulting citizens, holding a woman captive, and generally conducting themselves as an occupying force. The film was condemned by the National Legion of Decency. It was banned in Britain for 14 years. And it became the most culturally influential motorcycle film ever made, because it gave the American public a visual language for the motorcycle rider that was simultaneously frightening and romantic. Brando's performance as Johnny was not that of a villain. It was the performance of a lost soul. When a girl asks him, "What are you rebelling against?" and he answers, "What do you got?" the line produced not fear, but identification in the generation that heard it. The film's specific cultural damage was not that it made motorcycle riders look dangerous. It was that it made motorcycle riders look like a coherent cultural category with shared values and shared aesthetics that were opposed to mainstream American life. Before The Wild One, motorcycle riders were working men who rode for practical and recreational reasons. After The Wild One, motorcycle riders were rebels. The industry understood what had happened before most of the culture did. Leather jacket sales increased significantly in the years following the film's release. The specific style of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, the peaked cap, the leather jacket, the dungarees, became costume before it became culture. Men who had never ridden a motorcycle bought the jacket because Brando had worn it. I personally think that transition from practical garment to cultural costume is the moment when the motorcycle industry lost the culture it had been building for 50 years. Not because the jacket was wrong, because the jacket became more important than the machine. The symbol replaced the substance, and the people who came to motorcycling for the symbol rather than the substance changed what motorcycling was. Here's what the mainstream motorcycle culture of the 1950s looked like while Hollywood was constructing the outlaw myth. These two things existed simultaneously, and the documentary record of one was vastly more prominent than the documentary record of the other. The American Motorcyclists Association had approximately 100,000 registered members in the early 1950s. These were dues-paying members of sanctioned clubs who participated in organized events, gypsy tours, hill climbs, flat track racing, endurance events, and field meets. The association calendar for any given year in the early 1950s shows dozens of events across the country, organized by clubs with names like the Fresno Motorcycle Club, the Denver Motorcycle Club, the Chicago Motorcycle Club. Family events, summer weekends, American civic life, organized around a machine, family. Women competed. At a time when women's athletic participation was actively discouraged by most American institutions, motorcycle competition provided a specific exception. The women's division of flat track racing, sanctioned by the American Motorcyclists Association in the 1950s, was active and legitimate. Dorothy Dot Robinson, the most decorated female motorcycle competitor in American history, up to that point, won over 200 endurance events and rally competitions. She won the Jack Pine Enduro, one of the most demanding motorcycle endurance events in America, multiple times competing against men. Life magazine photographed her in 1948 as a housewife who happened to be America's greatest woman motorcycle competitor. The headline treated her as a curiosity. She was not a curiosity. She was the product of a culture that had been building female competition infrastructure for 30 years. The black motorcycle community rode too. The East Bay Dragons Motorcycle Club was founded in Oakland in 1959. Toby Jean Livingston, the founder, grew up in Oakland and started riding in the 1950s when the American Motorcyclists Association still had a whites-only membership policy. The black motorcycle clubs that formed in the 1950s and early 1960s in Oakland and Los Angeles, in Detroit, and in Chicago developed an entirely parallel culture to the mainstream because the mainstream culture's governing institution formally excluded them. They built their own events, their own runs, and their own community infrastructure. The mainstream motorcycle press did not cover any of it. The History Lounge did not cover any of it. This channel is one of the few places this part of the story has been told. The Korean War veterans arrived home in the early 1950s the same way the World War II veterans had arrived in the late 1940s, changed by what they had experienced, in need of a community that understood that change, and finding it on two wheels. The motorcycle clubs that formed around Korean War veterans in the early 1950s were structurally identical to the clubs formed by World War II veterans 5 years earlier. Working class men, practical machines, community organized around shared experience. Working class. The booze fighters, whose presence at Hollister had contributed to the incident that Life magazine mythologized, were a specific case in point. The club was founded in 1946 by Wino Willie Faulkner, a World War II veteran, at the All-American Bar in South Central Los Angeles. The name was a joke. The founder was not a violent man. He was a veteran who liked to ride and liked to drink and thought it was funny to name a club after both habits. The booze fighters participated in events sanctioned by the American Motorcyclists Association. They entered sanctioned competitions. When the Hollister incident produced the Life magazine photograph, the booze fighters were specifically mischaracterized as the primary source of disorder. The historical record does not support that characterization. Faulkner himself said so repeatedly in interviews before his death. After Hollister and after the Wild One, the American Motorcyclists Association, known as AMA, issued a statement that produced more lasting cultural damage than either the photograph or the film. The trouble at Hollister was caused by the 1% of motorcyclists who are outlaws and undesirables. The other 99% are good, decent, law-abiding citizens. The AMA has never confirmed that this statement was actually issued in this exact form. Multiple scholars who have researched the organization's historical records have been unable to locate the original document. The statement may be an apocryphal distillation of positions the AMA took in the aftermath of Hollister. It may be the editorial summary of a press release that did not survive. It may have been invented entirely and retroactively attributed to the AMA because it was a useful organizing statement for the culture that followed. What the statement produced was the 1% identity. The clubs that rejected the AMA's framing, that rejected the 99% designation, and the implication that compliance with mainstream values was the measure of a legitimate rider, began wearing 1% patches as a declaration of identity. The Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Pagans, the Banditos. The four clubs that would eventually become the Big Four of outlaw motorcycle culture all adopted the 1% identity not as an admission of criminality, but as a rejection of the AMA's authority to define what a legitimate rider is. The specific irony of this moment is worth sitting with. The AMA, attempting to distance legitimate motorcycle culture from the outlaw myth that Hollywood and Life magazine had constructed, issued a statement that gave the outlaw myth its most enduring symbol. The 1% patch exists because the AMA tried to create a clean distinction between good riders and bad riders. The distinction backfired in the most complete way imaginable. By the mid-1950s, the outlaw biker was a fixed cultural archetype, not because the culture that produced it was large. In 1955, the total membership of all clubs that would eventually be classified as 1% organizations was a few thousand people at most, against an AMA membership of 100,000 and a broader motorcycle riding population of several hundred thousand. The outlaw culture was a fringe. Hollywood made it the center. Stop here for a moment. Think about the rider who taught you to ride, or the person who first put you on a motorcycle, or the club you rode with for 20 years that the mainstream culture never understood. This video is the document they deserve. Share it to the Facebook group where your riding community lives. Post it to Our Motorcycles on Reddit. Post it to Our Vintage Motorcycles. Send it to the person who has been riding for 40 years and would recognize every single thing we are talking about. The algorithm shows this video to more people every time someone shares it outside YouTube. You sharing it right now is the most direct way to make sure this history reaches the people who need it. While Hollywood was constructing and reconstructing the outlaw biker identity through the 1950s, an entirely different motorcycle culture was developing that no film has ever properly documented, and that most people, even most motorcyclists, know almost nothing about: the desert racers. The off-road community that emerged from the southwestern United States in the late 1940s and developed through the 1950s into the most technically demanding motorcycle culture America has ever produced. The terrain of the Mojave Desert does not forgive incompetence. The arroyos and dry lake beds and Rocky Mountain passes of the California and Nevada desert produced riding conditions that required a specific kind of machine, light, reliable, capable of handling terrain that would destroy a road bike, and a specific kind of rider. The desert racer of the 1950s was not performing an identity. He was solving a problem. The problem was how to cover desert terrain at speed without dying. The solution was mechanical knowledge, physical fitness, riding skill developed over thousands of miles, and a machine that he had likely built or significantly modified himself. The Big Bear Run, the Greenhorn Enduro, the Catalina Grand Prix, run on Catalina Island. These were the events that defined American off-road motorcycle competition in the 1950s. The riders who competed in them, men like Bud Ekins, who would later serve as Steve McQueen's stunt double in The Great Escape, and Malcolm Smith, who would become the protagonist of Bruce Brown's On Any Sunday, were the most skilled motorcycle riders in America. None of them were outlaws. None of them appeared in the popular press as examples of motorcycle culture. Hollywood had defined what motorcycle culture looked like, and it looked like Marlon Brando in a leather jacket, not Bud Ekins in a dust-covered jersey finishing a 200-mile desert race. Steve McQueen himself is worth discussing specifically. McQueen started riding motorcycles in the early 1950s. He competed in enduros. He raced the 6 Days Trial in 1964 as part of the United States team. He won a silver medal at the International 6 Days Trial in 1964. He was, by the objective standard of competition results, one of the most accomplished motorcycle racers America produced in that era. What Hollywood made him famous for was not his racing, it was The Great Escape, in which he rode a Triumph TR6 trophy motorcycle through a scene that his own skill as a rider made possible. The motorcycle jumping the barbed wire fence is the image people remember. McQueen drove the fence side himself. Bud Ekins, his friend and fellow desert racer, drove the Allied side because the production insurance would not allow McQueen to take both risks. The most famous motorcycle scene in Hollywood history was made possible by the desert racing culture that Hollywood had spent a decade ignoring. The men who could do what that scene required were the men the popular culture had been looking past to focus on the staged photograph and the theatrical myth. This is the part of the story I find hardest to understand when I look at what the culture became. The 1950s motorcycle culture had women in it, not as accessories, not as passengers, as riders, as competitors, as the people who organized the events that made the culture what it was. The specific erasure of those women from the popular history of motorcycling is one of the most complete acts of historical revision I have encountered researching this channel. Dot Robinson. Already mentioned. But the full picture of who she was requires more than one sentence. She competed in the Jack Pine Enduro, a 500-mile, 2-day endurance event through Michigan forest roads in all weather. And she won it against mixed fields. She did not win a women apostrophes division. She won the event against men who had been riding their entire lives. She did that in the early 1950s when the AMA apostrophe S official position was that women should be encouraged to ride as passengers. Linda Dugeau, the co-founder of the Motor Maids, the oldest all-women motorcycle organization in America, established in 1940. Dugeau rode a motorcycle from Providence, Rhode Island to San Jose, California to meet Dot Robinson at an AMA event in 1940. They decided that women who rode motorcycles needed an organization that recognized them as riders rather than as passengers of male riders. The Motor Maids were that organization. By the mid-1950s, the Motor Maids had chapters across the country, and their membership competed in AMA events at every level. The mainstream motorcycle press of the 1950s covered these women occasionally, always framed as curiosity, the exception rather than the norm, the woman who rides rather than the rider who happens to be a woman. The film The Wild One had no women riders. The outlaw biker films that followed The Wild One through the late 1950s and the 1960s featured women only as objects of threat or rescue. That absence helped build an outlaw image that excluded women from the center of the story. The culture that had produced Dot Robinson and the Motor Maids and the Van Buren sisters was replaced in the popular imagination by a culture in which women existed only in relation to men on motorcycles. That replacement did not happen because the culture changed. It happened because the camera pointed somewhere else. The motorcycle of the early 1950s, before the Japanese manufacturers arrived to fundamentally change what a motorcycle could be, was a machine that demanded complete engagement from its rider. The Harley-Davidson Panhead was introduced in 1948. It was named for the shape of the rocker covers, which resembled upside-down roasting pans. It replaced the knucklehead that had defined the preceding decade. The Panhead was a 74 cubic inch overhead valve V-twin that produced approximately 50 horsepower in its standard form. It had hydraulic lifters, a significant reliability improvement over the knucklehead's mechanical lifters. It had an aluminum cylinder head that dissipated heat more effectively than the cast iron head it replaced. It still leaked oil. It still required regular valve adjustments. It still needed its primary chain tensioned, its points set, its ignition timing checked, and its carburetor jetted for the altitude and temperature at which it was going to be ridden. A rider who owned a Panhead in 1952 was a mechanic. He had to be. The nearest dealer might be 50 miles away. The machine broke in ways that required immediate roadside intervention or a long walk to the nearest telephone. The Indian Chief was the last great Indian motorcycle before the company collapsed in 1953. It had skirted fenders and a 74 cubic inch flathead V-twin that made less power than the Panhead, but delivered torque that pulled the machine through terrain that would have stopped a smaller engine. The Indian rider of the early 1950s belonged to a culture that was ending even as he participated in it. By 1953, the factory was gone, the dealers were closing, and the parts supply was becoming problematic. The men who had been riding Indians since the 1930s were facing the particular grief of watching a machine they loved become impossible to maintain because the company that made it had ceased to exist. The British bikes. The Triumph Bonneville would not arrive until 1959, but through the early and mid-1950s, the Triumph Speed Twin and the Tiger were the machines American riders chose when they wanted lighter handling and a higher revving character rather than the American iron. Triumph dealers who had established themselves in the 1940s were building customer bases that would sustain the brand through its peak decades. The BSA Gold Star, a single-cylinder racing machine that became the most successful production race bike in Britain, began to appear on American tracks and endurance events in the early 1950s, ridden by men who found in the British machine what the American iron could not provide. This was a machine culture in the early 1950s. Specific machines, specific requirements, specific knowledge. A rider who knew his machine completely because the machine demanded to be known completely. The mechanic culture, the wrench culture, the man on Saturday morning with his hands inside a panhead engine making the adjustment that would determine how the machine ran on Sunday. Hollywood replaced that with a leather jacket and an attitude. The jacket was easier to sell than the knowledge. In 1960, there were 575,000 registered motorcycles in America. By 1969, there were 3 million, 5 times the number, in one decade. The largest single-decade expansion of motorcycle ownership in American history before or since. More motorcycles entered American roads between 1960 and 1969 than had existed in the entire country for the previous 60 years of the machine's existence. That number alone should stop you. But the number is the least interesting part of the story. What changed in the 1960s was not just how many Americans owned motorcycles. What changed was why they owned them, who was selling them, what the machines represented, and what happened to the working class culture that had built the foundation when the middle class arrived and decided motorcycles were interesting. The Honda CB750 had not yet arrived. That was 1969, the last year of the decade, a machine that would redefine everything. The Kawasaki Z1, the Yamaha RD350, the Japanese sport bike revolution, all of that was still ahead. What the 1960s produced was the transition, the hinge decade. The 10 years when the motorcycle stopped being a machine you bought because you needed it and started being a symbol you bought because of what it said about you. And I want to tell you exactly how that happened, because the specific forces that transformed motorcycle culture in the 1960s, the Honda marketing campaign that reached mainstream America, the British invasion that brought cafe racers, and the Triumph Bonneville to every garage in the country, the Vietnam War that sent a generation of young men to learn how to be comfortable with risk, and the single film released in July 1969 that made the motorcycle into the most powerful symbol of personal freedom in American popular culture, those forces did not serve the working class culture, they transformed. They replaced it. Understanding the 1960s is understanding the moment the trade was made, and understanding what was traded away. Before we talk about what the 1960s changed, we have to be specific about what existed before those changes arrived, because the mythology of motorcycle culture tends to start with Easy Rider, or the 1970s chopper scene, or the Hollister incident, and in doing so it erases 40 years of American motorcycle culture that preceded the moment the mainstream discovered it. By 1960, the motorcycle had been a working-class machine for 5 decades. Not a leisure product, not a lifestyle accessory. Transportation. Practical, affordable, maintainable transportation for men who could not yet afford automobiles, who lived in cities where a machine that could split traffic was more practical than one that could not, who worked in factories and mills and trades where mechanical knowledge was a baseline competency, and maintaining a motorcycle was not a special skill, but simply the application of skills already held. The American Motorcyclists Association had been sanctioning clubs and events since the 1920s. The gypsy tours, the hill climbs, the flat track races that drew working class riders from the surrounding counties to a fairground for a weekend of competition. The AMA had 100,000 members by the early 1960s, not aspiring outlaws, not weekend warriors, not lifestyle consumers. Factory workers, machinists, tradesmen, men who rode because the machine was useful and loved because the machine was honest. The dominant machines of 1960 were American and British. Harley-Davidson held a significant share of the super heavyweight category. The British manufacturers, Triumph, BSA, Norton, had been expanding their American market presence since the 1950s and had developed devoted followings in the process. The Triumph Bonneville, introduced in 1959, was the machine that serious riders who wanted performance without a Harley size and weight were choosing. It handled. It responded. It made a sound unlike anything the American factories were producing. A new Harley-Davidson Sportster in 1960 cost approximately $1,200. A Triumph Bonneville was similar in price. A factory worker earning the median industrial wage of around $5,000 per year could buy either machine for roughly 2.5 months of gross income. The motorcycle was genuinely accessible to the working-class rider who prioritized it. The culture around these machines was built on knowledge. The 1960 motorcycle rider who bought a Triumph Bonneville understood that he was buying a machine with certain characteristics: a tendency toward vibration at a high RPM, a requirement for regular valve adjustment, a specific carburetor tuning sensitivity that rewarded attentiveness and punished neglect. He understood this because the culture transmitted this understanding. Older riders taught younger riders. Clubs maintained archives of mechanical knowledge. The dealer who sold you the machine was often the man who had ridden the same model for years and could tell you from personal experience what it needed. That culture, dense, specific, requiring genuine competence, was what existed in 1960. It was not glamorous by any mainstream standard. It was not photographed by Life magazine. It was not the subject of Hollywood films. It was men who understood machines, riding them on weekends and maintaining them in garages, and transmitting knowledge to each other through direct conversation. It was real in a way that what replaced it was not. In 1959, Honda opened its first American subsidiary in Los Angeles. The machines they brought, the Honda Dream, the Super Cub, small displacement reliable commuters that bore almost no resemblance to the Harley Knucklehead or the Triumph Bonneville in either appearance or purpose, were not immediately recognized as a threat by the American manufacturers. They were regarded as toys, underpowered, unserious, the machines of people who were not yet ready for real motorcycles. The American manufacturers' failure to take Honda seriously is one of the most documented cases of competitive blindness in manufacturing history, and it produced consequences that permanently altered the American motorcycle landscape. The You Meet the Nicest People on a Honda campaign launched in 1963, created by the advertising agency Gray Advertising in partnership with Honda's American management. The campaign was the most consequential piece of motorcycle marketing in American history. Not because it sold motorcycles, though it sold enormous numbers of motorcycles, but because it changed who believed motorcycles were for them. The Nicest People campaign ran in mainstream publications, Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post. It showed ordinary Americans, housewives, doctors, teachers, college students on Honda motorcycles in suburban settings, picnics, shopping trips, campus rides. The images were deliberately carefully constructed to position the Honda motorcycle as the opposite of the outlaw biker image that Hollywood and Life magazine itself had spent 15 years constructing. The message was explicit and effective. This is not that. The motorcycle you see in these photographs is not the machine of the wild one, or the Hollister rioter, or the one percenter. This is the machine of your neighbor, your doctor, the college student who lives down the hall. This machine is for you if you are the kind of person who reads this magazine and lives in this kind of neighborhood and has these kinds of aspirations. It worked. It worked beyond any metric Honda's American management had projected. Between 1963 and 1965, Honda's American sales grew from approximately 40,000 units to over 200,000 units annually. The company that American manufacturers had dismissed as a toy manufacturer had become the most important force in American motorcycling in less than a decade. I personally think the Nicest People campaign is the single most important piece of cultural work in the history of American motorcycle culture. Not because it was good for the culture, but because it fundamentally changed what the culture was about. Before the campaign, motorcycle culture was defined by people who rode motorcycles. After the campaign, motorcycle culture was also defined by people who were attracted to what motorcycles represented. Those are not the same constituency, and they do not want the same things from the machine or from each other. While Honda was building the mainstream middle-class market from the bottom, the British manufacturers were doing something entirely different at the top. They were creating the most technically and aesthetically sophisticated motorcycle culture America had ever seen, and they were doing it through machines that demanded genuine skill and rewarded riders who developed it. The Triumph Bonneville T1 became the aspirational machine of the early 1960s for riders who wanted performance. Steve McQueen rode Triumphs. Evel Knievel started on Triumphs. The Bonneville was the machine associated with the world's most physically and technically demanding motorcycle racing, the Isle of Man TT, and that association gave it a credibility that no American machine was matching in the early part of the decade. The cafe racer culture that developed around the British bikes in the early 1960s was the most technically engaged motorcycle culture the country had seen. Cafe racers, named for the practice of racing between London cafes, specifically the Ace Cafe, where riders would set a record time for a predetermined route, were not choppers. They were the opposite of choppers. Where the chopper extended and lowered and simplified, the cafe racer tightened and lightened and refined, clip-on handlebars, rear-set foot pegs, a lean-forward, aggressive riding position that put the rider in dialogue with the machine rather than lounging away from it. The cafe racer rider of the early 1960s knew his machine completely. The BSA Gold Star that was the premier British single-cylinder competition machine required setup knowledge that went beyond what any manual provided. The specific carburetor needle clip position for your altitude and temperature, the ignition advance curve that your particular engine had developed over its service life, the specific tension on the primary chain that balanced wear against power loss. These were not factory settings. They were personal knowledge developed through miles and attention. The British manufacturers were, by the mid-1960s, beginning to show the cracks that would eventually destroy them. Labor relations at the British factories had deteriorated badly. Production quality was inconsistent. The engineers who were developing the machines were not always in communication with the management who were pricing and positioning them. Triumph was producing extraordinary machines alongside poorly assembled ones. BSA was struggling with management decisions that its workers disagreed with, and its customers were beginning to notice. But in the early 1960s, before the Japanese manufacturers had fully demonstrated what engineering discipline and production quality could produce at scale, the British bikes were the technical standard against which everything else was measured. And the culture they built in America in that period, technically demanding, aesthetically specific, built around genuine riding competence, was the most sophisticated motorcycle culture the country had produced. That culture would be buried under the avalanche of the late 1960s. But it existed, and its existence mattered. If you're watching this and thinking about someone who rode in the 1960s, a father, an uncle, an older friend who has been trying to tell you about what motorcycles were before Easy Rider changed everything, send them this video right now. Not later. Now. The story of the Honda Nicest People campaign and what it did to a culture that had been building honestly for 40 years is the story most motorcycle documentaries skip entirely. Share it to any group where riders gather, Facebook groups, family chats, anywhere riders talk. The culture that gets forgotten is the culture that got covered up. Every share matters. The 1960s motorcycle story cannot be told without Vietnam. Not because Vietnam caused motorcycle culture, the machines and the clubs and the culture existed before the war, but because Vietnam sent a specific generation of young men through a specific set of experiences that made motorcycles, when they came home, the most natural object in the world for what they needed. Between 1964 and 1973, approximately 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. The peak years of deployment were the mid to late 1960s. Men who were 18 and 20 in 1965 and 1966 were in Vietnam. Men who had grown up in the early years of the motorcycle expansion, who had seen the Honda advertising and the British bikes and the beginning of the chopper scene, were now in a conflict that would mark them in ways that no previous generation of American veterans had been marked in quite the same way. The Vietnam War was not the World War II experience. The men who came home from the Pacific and from Europe in 1945 came home to parades, to the GI Bill, to a country that understood itself as having been at war and was grateful for the men who had fought it. The men who came home from Vietnam came home to something more complicated. Some came home to protests. Some came home to indifference. Almost all came home to a civilian society that had been having its own transformations during the years they were away, and that did not always know what to do with men whose experience had been so specifically different. The motorcycle gave these men several things simultaneously. It gave them a machine that demanded the same kind of attentive competence that their training had demanded, a machine that rewarded presence and punished distraction. It gave them a community organized around shared experience and mutual respect rather than around the social hierarchies of the civilian world. And it gave them movement, the specific freedom of being in motion on a road with no particular destination, which is the freedom that is hardest to name, but that veterans who have come home often describe as the thing they missed most. The Vietnam Vets MC, which would eventually become one of the most respected veteran motorcycle organizations in the country, put it in a single sentence that I have been thinking about ever since I first encountered it. They said, "We went away as patriots and returned as outlaws." The motorcycle did not cause that transformation, but it absorbed it. The machine became the place where men who felt rejected by their own country could still build something and belong to something and move through a landscape on their own terms. This is the specific emotional weight that the 1970s motorcycle culture would carry into Sturgis and onto the highways and into the clubs and into the garages, the weight of men who had been somewhere that the civilian world could not reach and who needed a machine that met them at that level. The 1960s planted the seeds. The returning veterans would bring the harvest. While the chopper scene was developing in the garages of the urban and suburban East and Midwest, California was producing an entirely different kind of motorcycle culture that the national press ignored almost completely, one that would eventually produce some of the most technically skilled riders the country had ever seen, and that would provide the foundation for Bruce Brown's On Any Sunday in 1971. The desert racing culture of the American Southwest in the 1960s was built around purpose-built competition machines. The Husqvarna, the Maiko, the Bultaco Persang, and the CZ that had come from European manufacturers who had developed off-road competition technology that American manufacturers were not building. These were not highway machines. They were not even road legal in most configurations. They were built for the specific demands of desert terrain, for the Baja 1000 that was first run in 1967, for the Greenhorn Enduro and the Elsinore Grand Prix, and the events that drew the serious off-road community of California, Nevada, and Arizona. Malcolm Smith, who would become one of the most recognizable faces in American off-road competition, was developing his skills in the California desert in the 1960s on machines that required a level of mechanical knowledge and physical capability that the highway rider rarely needed. The desert does not permit incompetence. A machine that fails 20 miles from the nearest road on a day when the temperature is 105 degrees is not an inconvenience. It is a survival situation. The Scrambler, a machine designed for mixed use, capable on road and off, with high-mounted exhaust pipes that could clear obstacles and a suspension travel generous enough to handle terrain that would destroy a standard road bike, was the 1960s version of what we now call the adventure motorcycle. The Honda CL72 Scrambler, the Triumph TR6 Trophy, the BSA Victor. These were the machines of riders who were not interested in the style statement of the chopper, but in the practical expansion of where a motorcycle could take you. Steve McQueen understood what these machines were. McQueen began racing motorcycles seriously in the early 1960s, and by the middle of the decade was competing in the International 6 Days Trial, the most demanding off-road competition in the world, as part of the United States team. He won a silver medal at the 1964 ISDT. That achievement, not the Great Escape motorcycle jump, not the bullet car chase, is the actual measure of what McQueen was on a motorcycle. He was a serious competitive rider who could represent his country in international competition. McQueen's visibility brought attention to the off-road culture in a way that the California desert racing community had not received before. Riders who had known McQueen as an actor discovered that he was also a genuine motorcycle competitor. The machines he rode, the Husqvarna and the ISDT, the Indian motorcycle and On Any Sunday, were not the Captain America chopper of the Hollywood imagination. They were functional, unromantic, purpose-built competition machines that asked their riders to be completely competent. By 1967, something was happening in American culture at large that was going to profoundly change the meaning of the motorcycle in ways that neither the working-class riders, nor the British bike enthusiasts, nor the California desert racers had anticipated or would have chosen. The counterculture had been building through the early 1960s, in the coffee houses of Greenwich Village, in the college campuses where students were organizing against the Vietnam War, in the neighborhoods of San Francisco where a specific utopian urban experiment was underway. The counterculture was not primarily a motorcycle culture. It was a music culture, a political culture, a culture of specific substances and specific aesthetics and specific rejections of mainstream American values. But the motorcycle connected to the counterculture for the same reason it connected to the Vietnam veterans. It represented freedom from the institutional structures that both groups were rejecting. The motorcycle did not answer to a schedule. It did not require a specific route. It moved through space on terms that the rider set rather than terms that the infrastructure imposed. For a counterculture that was explicitly rejecting the architecture of mainstream American life, the motorcycle was a natural symbol. The problem, and I want to be precise about this because it matters for everything that followed, is that the counterculture's relationship to the motorcycle was primarily symbolic. The men who had built motorcycle culture through the 1940s and the 1950s and into the 1960s had a relationship to the machine that was mechanical, practical, competence-based. The counterculture had a relationship to the motorcycle that was primarily about what it meant to ride one, which is a fundamentally different thing. When a machine becomes a symbol before it becomes a tool, the people who adopt it for its symbolic meaning do not develop the relationship with the machine that the tool demands. They buy the statement, they wear the costume, they attend the events. And the culture that was built on the requirement of genuine knowledge begins to accommodate people who have not met and do not intend to meet that requirement. This is not a moral critique of the counterculture. It is an accurate description of what happened to motorcycle culture when the counterculture discovered it. The same process would happen again in the 1980s when the baby boomers with disposable income discovered Harley-Davidson. The same process would happen again in the 2000 Saisis when American Chopper made custom motorcycles into a television entertainment product. Every time a machine becomes a symbol to a new demographic, the culture built on knowledge of the machine has to decide what to do with people who want the symbol without earning the knowledge. In October 1968, Honda unveiled the CB750 at the Tokyo Motor Show. It arrived in American dealers in 1969 for $1,495. The CB750 had 4 cylinders. It had a disc brake on the front. It featured electric start. It produced 70 horsepower. It accelerated from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. It had a top speed of over 120 miles per hour. It was faster than anything Harley-Davidson was producing. It was more reliable than anything the British manufacturers were producing. It was $500 less than a comparable American or British machine, and it started every time you pressed the button. The motorcycle press called it the superbike. The designation stuck because nothing better described what it was, a machine that redefined what a production motorcycle could be. It demonstrated by its mere existence that the quality and performance standards the American and British industries had been accepting were not limitations of the technology, but limitations of ambition and investment. For the American manufacturers, the CB750 was not a competitive challenge. It was a verdict. Harley-Davidson's response was to lean harder into identity, the emotional meaning of the American machine, the tradition, the culture. The British manufacturer's response was inadequate investment in engineering and production quality until it was too late. Both strategies would eventually prove insufficient. The CB750 had demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated. A motorcycle could be extraordinary and affordable and reliable simultaneously. Every manufacturer that did not match all three of those conditions simultaneously was now operating under a competitive disadvantage that no amount of cultural positioning could permanently overcome. For the culture at large, the CB750 arrived in the same year as Easy Rider. The two events together, the machine that proved the future belonged to engineering, and the film that made the motorcycle into the defining symbol of American freedom, completed the transformation that the decade had been building toward. Easy Rider opened in July 1969, written by Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper, directed by Hopper. Budget approximately $400,000. Box office approximately $60 million. One of the most profitable films in Hollywood history relative to its cost. The film follows two motorcycle riders, Wyatt, played by Peter Fonda, and Billy, played by Hopper, as they ride from Los Angeles to New Orleans on the proceeds of a cocaine sale. The Captain America chopper ridden by Wyatt, stars and stripes paint, long raked forks, high-rise handlebars, became the most recognized motorcycle in American history within weeks of the film's release. The film's thesis, stated in its tagline, was, "A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere." The motorcycle was the vehicle of the search, not just literally as the machines the characters rode, but symbolically. The motorcycle represented the possibility of a freedom that the America the characters encountered could not accommodate. What the film did to motorcycle culture was not what the motorcycle culture would have chosen. The working class riders who had built the culture through 40 years of garages and races and clubs did not see themselves in the Captain America chopper or in Peter Fonda's sunglasses. The California desert racers who were competing in the ISDT did not see themselves there. The British bike enthusiasts who had spent years learning to tune a Bonneville carb did not see themselves there. What Easy Rider did was create a new constituency for motorcycles, the largest single constituency motorcycles had ever had, composed of people who were drawn not to the machine, but to the symbol. Young men in 1969 and 1970 who walked into motorcycle dealerships asking for something like that were not asking for a machine to maintain and understand and develop a relationship with. They were asking for the symbol, for the freedom the film had shown them, for the specific visual language of the Captain America chopper. The comment in the rise and fall of Chopper's video with 803 likes says it most directly. You never mentioned the biggest influence on the radical choppers of the 1960s and 1970s, LSD. It is an irreverent observation that contains a real insight. The extreme chopper, the machine with forks extended to the point of handling difficulty, sissy bars reaching into the sky, a visual statement that overwhelmed any practical consideration, was not the natural evolution of the motorcycle as a tool. It was the natural evolution of the motorcycle as a symbol. It was art, not engineering. Beautiful in the specific way that impractical things built with genuine skill are beautiful. And like all art made purely for visual impact, it had a natural limit. The specific irony of Easy Rider, the film that made the motorcycle into the most powerful symbol of American freedom in popular culture, is in its ending. The Captain America chopper is destroyed by men in a pickup truck who cannot tolerate the freedom it represents. The film that made millions of Americans want a motorcycle did so by showing a motorcycle being destroyed. The freedom the motorcycle symbolized was shown to be something that the America it was searching through could not protect. Easy Rider changed everything about who thought motorcycles were for them. If you know a rider who was young in 1969 and remembers what happened to the motorcycle culture they had known before that film arrived, share this video with them. And if you are a rider who got into motorcycles because of a film, a symbol, an image, share it with the person who taught you that the machine demanded more than admiration. Send it to your writing group. Post it anywhere writers talk. The history of how this culture was transformed from something built on knowledge into something built on symbol is the history that explains everything that followed. By the end of 1969, the decade's transformation was complete. 5 million registered motorcycles would arrive within 5 more years. The culture had been split between the working class knowledge culture that had built it and the symbol culture that the decade's marketing and filmmaking had created, between the CB650 that represented the engineering future and the Captain America chopper that represented the symbolic present, between the writers who had been there before the mainstream discovered it and the writers who came because the mainstream suddenly decided motorcycles were interesting. The specific forces that drove the transformation were 5 in number, and none of them were motivated by the interests of the culture they were transforming. Honda's You Meet the Nicest People campaign was motivated by Honda's interest in selling motorcycles to the American middle class. That it also stripped the working class culture of its social exclusivity was a consequence, not a goal. The counterculture's adoption of the motorcycle was motivated by the counterculture's need for symbols of freedom. That it brought to the culture a large constituency of symbol seekers rather than machine understanders was a consequence, not a goal. Easy Rider was motivated by Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper's interest in making a film. That it created the largest single cohort of new writers the culture had ever seen, most of whom wanted the symbol rather than the machine, was a consequence, not a goal. Vietnam produced the most mechanically and psychologically capable generation of writers the culture had ever absorbed. That their culture's public image would be defined by the symbol seekers rather than by them was not their choice. The CB750 was Honda's engineering response to a competitive opportunity. That it made the British manufacturer's products uncompetitive and accelerated the collapse of the industry that had produced the most sophisticated American motorcycle culture of the decade was a consequence, not a goal. No single actor in the 1960s chose to transform motorcycle culture from a knowledge culture into a symbol culture. The transformation happened through the intersection of forces that were each pursuing their own interest. The culture that resulted, the 5 million registered motorcycles, the chopper boom, the Easy Rider generation, was the outcome of those interests colliding, not the product of anyone's design. I personally think that is the most important thing to understand about the 1960s motorcycle story. What was lost in that decade was not taken by anyone with bad intentions. It was transformed by forces that had no particular interest in preserving what existed. That is usually how things that matter are lost. In 1945, at the end of World War II, there were 198,000 registered motorcycles in the United States. That is the entire country. 198,000 machines. By 1960, that number had grown to 575,000. Still modest. Still a notch. Then something happened that the motorcycle industry had never seen before and has never quite seen since. Between 1960 and 1965, 5 years, the number of registered motorcycles in America surged from 575,000 to 1,382,000. It more than doubled. By 1971, it had surpassed 3 million. And as of 1974, Americans had registered a total of 5 million motorcycles on the country's roads and highways. 5 million motorcycles in a country of 210 million people. 1 for every 42 Americans. In a decade and a half. What caused that? Several things happened at once, and understanding all of them is the only way to understand what the 1970s motorcycle culture actually was, because the culture that formed around those 5 million bikes was shaped directly by who was buying them and why. The first force was Easy Rider. The 1969 film starring Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper did something no motorcycle manufacturer's advertising campaign had ever accomplished. It made the motorcycle into a symbol of freedom that reached people who had never considered owning one. The Captain America chopper, long forks, raked frame, stars, and stripes paint became the most recognized motorcycle image in American history within weeks of the film's release. Demand for choppers specifically exploded. Custom builders who had been working out of garages for small local clienteles suddenly had national reputations and waiting lists. The second force was Honda's You Meet the Nicest People campaign, which had run through the 1960s and succeeded in stripping the outlaw stigma from motorcycles for a mainstream middle-class audience. By 1970, the cultural message had bifurcated. Riding was simultaneously outlaw freedom and wholesome transportation, and somehow both messages were pulling people in. The third force was the most important one for understanding the culture that formed. They were coming home from Vietnam. Between 1964 and 1973, approximately 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. They came home in waves. And unlike the World War II generation, which came home to parades and the GI Bill in a country that called them heroes, the Vietnam veterans came home to something that was, and I want to say this carefully and accurately, deeply complicated. Some came home to indifference. Some came home to outright hostility. Many came home to a country that did not know what to do with them and was not particularly interested in figuring it out. The 1973 recession hit the same year the last troops came home. Jobs were scarce. The skills they had spent years developing were not exactly in demand in a peacetime economy. And many of these men, young, disciplined, trained for high-stress environments, looking for something that made sense in a world that did not, found motorcycles. The Vietnam vet's MC would later put it in a single sentence that I think is one of the most honest descriptions of that moment in American history. They said, "We went away as patriots and returned as outlaws." The motorcycle did not cause that transformation, but it absorbed it. The machine became the place where men who felt rejected by their own country could still build something, belong to something, and move through a landscape on their own terms. To understand the 1970s motorcycle culture, you have to understand what the machines actually were. Because the relationship between rider and machine in that era was completely different from what it is today. And the difference is not about quality. The difference is about what the machine demanded of you. The dominant American motorcycle of the 1970s was the Harley Davidson, specifically the shovelhead V-twin that powered everything from the Sportster to the Electra Glide. The shovelhead had been in production since 1966, and it was, by the standards of the era, a powerful and characterful engine that rewarded riders who understood it and punished those who did not. The 1970 Harley-Davidson FLH Electra Glide sold for somewhere between $2,500 and $2,900 new. The Sportster was around $2,000. A factory worker in a manufacturing job earning the median industrial wage of roughly $7,500 per year in 1970 could buy a new Sportster for about 3 months of gross income. A new Harley was genuinely attainable for a working-class rider who chose to prioritize it. Now here's the part of the Harley story in the 1970s that the official brand history tends to gloss over, and I personally think deserves to be stated clearly. In 1969, the founding family sold Harley-Davidson to American Machine and Foundry, AMF, a company whose primary expertise was bowling equipment. AMF was not wrong to see that the motorcycle market was exploding. They invested capital that Harley-Davidson needed. But what they did with the production line was, depending on who you ask, either necessary for survival or nearly fatal to the brand. AMF pushed Harley's factories to double their output. Production doubled. Quality control did not keep pace. The result was that as many as 30% of the vehicles coming off the assembly line were incomplete. Workers went on strike, a 100-day strike, unhappy with management decisions that they felt were destroying the product they built with pride. Dealers received bikes that were not fully assembled and sometimes had to complete the work themselves on the showroom floor. Riders bought new Harleys and immediately started fixing things that should not have needed fixing. The nicknames that attach themselves to AMF-era Harleys tell you everything about what riders thought. Hardly drivable, hardly Abelson, Hogley Ferguson. Harley's market share in the super heavyweight category had been 80% in 1969. By 1979, it was 20%. The Japanese manufacturers had moved in while Harley was building bikes that leaked oil and stalled. But here's the thing about that story that gets missed every time it is told as a simple corporate failure narrative. The riders who bought those AMF Harleys and dealt with the problems, they fixed them. They learned every system. They developed deep diagnostic knowledge from necessity. They built relationships with independent mechanics who knew the shovelhead the way a surgeon knows an anatomy. And many of those riders will tell you today that owning an imperfect machine that demanded your attention was a better education in motorcycles than owning a perfect one would have been. The Japanese machines told a completely different story. In 1969, Honda released the CB750, the first true superbike, and it was faster, smoother, and more reliable than anything Harley was building. In 1972, Kawasaki released the Z1 900cc inline 4, which embarrassed the American machines in every performance metric. Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki were offering better engineered, more efficient, lower cost motorcycles throughout the 1970s, and riders who did not have brand loyalty to Harley were buying them without hesitation. The result was a 1970s motorcycle landscape that was genuinely diverse in a way that American motorcycle culture has not been since. You had Harley loyalists who would ride nothing else and could fix anything on the machine by hand. You had Japanese bike riders who chose their machines for performance and reliability. You had custom builders working across both platforms. And you had somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million registered motorcycles on American roads by the middle of the decade, the highest per capita motorcycle ownership in American history. The image of the 1970s motorcycle culture that the industry would like you to have is the factory product, the showroom floor, the advertised machine. That image is almost entirely false. The culture was built in garages. It was built by men with no formal training and no backing who figured things out because figuring things out was the only option available to them. And a few of those men became so good at what they did in those garages that their work defined what American motorcycles look like for generations. Arlen Ness is the most important figure in that story, and I personally think he is one of the most underappreciated Americans in the history of manufacturing. Not motorcycle manufacturing, manufacturing. Because what Ness did was not just build beautiful motorcycles, he built an entire industry around the idea that production machines were starting points, not finished products. Ness grew up in San Lorenzo, California. He worked as a pin setter at a bowling alley and later as a postal worker and furniture mover. He played semi-professional bowling and used his tournament earnings to buy his first motorcycle in 1963, a 1947 Harley-Davidson Knucklehead for $300. He took it to his home garage in San Leandro and started customizing it. He had no formal training. He had a spray gun and a vision. The first customized Ness bike won awards at motorcycle shows. Riders started asking him to work on their bikes. By the early 1970s, his business had grown enough that he moved from his home garage to a storefront on East 14th Street in San Leandro. He was now a professional builder. He created his first catalog, actually, as he described it, a list that his wife Bev typed up with handwritten prices next to each item. What Ness built in those years was not the Easy Rider chopper. He explicitly rejected that direction. The Easy Rider aesthetic was tall, high handlebars reaching for the sky, extended forks pushing the front wheel far out in front, sissy bars climbing above the rider's head. Ness went the opposite direction. He pioneered what became known as the digger style, or low rider chopper, frames slammed to the ground, goose-necked steering heads, flat handlebars, minimal seat, angular fuel tank following the frame line. He was drawing from California's drag racing scene rather than the chopper counterculture. The result was machines that looked like they were going fast standing still. Every major custom builder after Ness was either building on what he established or consciously reacting against it. He had done, from a bowling alley paycheck and a home garage, what no corporation with a design department and an engineering team had managed to do. He created a genuinely new American aesthetic for the motorcycle. The builders who worked outside the coasts had their own sensibilities. In the Northeast, custom builders adapted the chopper form for an environment that was not the open California highway. Indian Larry, who would come to wider fame later but whose roots were in the 1970s New York scene, pioneered what you might call the urban survival chopper. Narrow enough to split gridlock traffic, low enough to navigate tight spaces, loud enough to announce its presence to drivers who were not looking. These were not show bikes, they were tools. In the Midwest, In shops scattered across manufacturing towns where skilled metal workers and machinists had the background to do precision fabrication, custom building had a different character again. More engineering, less art. Machines built to a standard of function that the California aesthetic sometimes sacrificed. The common thread across all of it was that the people building these motorcycles had skin in the game that went beyond money. They were building their identities. The machine was the statement about who you were, where you came from, what you believed, what you were willing to work for. No two bikes were the same because no two builders were the same. That diversity of expression, that organic development of a culture from the ground up, is what was lost when the industry consolidated. When the custom motorcycle became a factory offering, when you could buy a custom look from a showroom, something that had required years of skill and vision to produce became something you could have for a lease payment. The word club has accumulated so much mythology, positive and negative, that it is almost impossible to use accurately. So let me be precise about what the 1970s motorcycle club landscape actually looked like, because it was considerably more complicated than either the romanticized version or the criminal organization version that tend to dominate the storytelling. The outlaw club world was real and was not romantic. The Hells Angels had patched over the Aliens chapter in New York City in December 1969. And by the mid-1970s, the New York chapter had become one of the club's largest and most powerful in the country. What had started as post-war rebels on motorcycles had, by the 1970s, evolved into something considerably darker. Organizations involved in drug distribution, contract violence, and territorial warfare with rival clubs. The biker wars of the 1970s were not mythologized outlaw freedom. They were real conflicts over real criminal enterprise that resulted in real deaths. But the outlaw world was not the motorcycle club world. It was a fraction of it, and the fraction it represented had an outsized cultural footprint that obscured the much larger community underneath. The AMA, the American Motorcyclists Association, had hundreds of sanctioned clubs across the country. These were the clubs that organized charity rides, that showed up to support veterans events, that ran the Daytona Bike Week activities, and the Sturgis Rally festivities that were not about criminality. These clubs provided the same function for their members that the outlaw clubs provided for theirs: brotherhood, belonging, a shared identity built around a shared passion without the criminal element. Sturgis itself tells the story of how the community grew through the decade. In 1970, the rally drew 3,000 riders. 3,000. By 1975, it had expanded to a 7-day event and was drawing tens of thousands. By the end of the decade, 30,000 riders per year were making the journey to the Black Hills of South Dakota. What had been a regional racing event, organized by the Jack Pine Gypsies Motorcycle Club, was becoming a national pilgrimage, a place where riders from every region and every background showed up and recognized each other as part of the same culture. That recognition, the nod between riders on the road, the unspoken acknowledgement that you are part of something, was the social fabric of the 1970s motorcycle culture. It required nothing from you beyond showing up on a bike. No brand loyalty required, no club affiliation required, no particular level of wealth or status required. You rode. You were part of it. The Vietnam veterans who flooded into motorcycle culture after 1973 brought something specific with them that changed the community's character. They had operational discipline, the ability to execute, to plan, to look after the people next to them under pressure. Clubs built around veteran membership ran with a structure and a seriousness that purely recreational clubs sometimes lacked. The Rolling Thunder event, which would eventually become one of the largest veteran gatherings in American history, had its spiritual roots in this period. Veterans who felt invisible to the country that had sent them to war, finding visibility and voice through the culture of riding. I personally think the Vietnam veteran motorcycle community is the most important and least understood chapter of the 1970s American motorcycle history. These were men who came home carrying something they could not fully explain to anyone who had not been there. The motorcycle gave them something to do with it. The road gave them somewhere to put it. The club gave them people who did not need it explained. By the mid-1970s, the motorcycle community had 5 million registered bikes and real political weight for the first time in its history. And the political fight that erupted in this period set the template for every regulatory battle in motorcycle culture that has happened since. In 1966, Congress passed the Highway Safety Act, which included provisions that could effectively require states to mandate helmet use as a condition of receiving federal highway funding. By the early 1970s, 47 states had enacted mandatory helmet laws under this pressure. The rider response was organized and fierce. This was not a fringe campaign. This was a mainstream motorcycle community, millions of riders, not thousands, mobilizing against a law that many saw as the first major encroachment of the government into a decision that should belong to the individual rider. The argument was simple. The risk of riding without a helmet falls on the rider. No one else is endangered by my uncovered head. The government's interest in my personal safety does not override my personal liberty. The political pressure worked. In 1976, Congress removed the financial penalty on states that did not enforce helmet laws. Within 2 years, 28 states had repealed their mandatory helmet requirements. It was one of the most successful grassroots political campaigns in motorcycle history, and it was run by riders who organized through their clubs, their rallies, and their shared understanding that what happened in one state would eventually reach theirs. I am not going to tell you whether mandatory helmet laws are right or wrong. I personally wear a helmet every time I ride, and I have for years. But the political fight over helmets in the 1970s matters to this story because it demonstrated something about the motorcycle community that is often overlooked. When the community was genuinely united around a shared interest, not divided by brand loyalty, not fragmented by marketing positioning, not sorted into demographic categories by the industry, it was capable of winning. The oil crisis of 1973 added another dimension to the motorcycle's cultural and practical position in America. When OPEC cut oil production and gas lines formed at stations across the country, suddenly the motorcycle's fuel efficiency became a serious practical consideration for people who had previously thought of it purely as a lifestyle choice. A Honda CB750 that could travel 50 miles on a gallon of gas was not just a freedom machine, it was a sensible response to a crisis that nobody had seen coming. Motorcycle registrations, which had already been climbing through the late 1960s and early 1970s, got another push from the oil crisis. People who had not previously thought about riding started thinking about it. The 5 million registration number by 1974 reflects both the cultural momentum from Easy Rider and the practical calculation of fuel costs that the oil crisis introduced. By the late 1970s, something was changing. It did not announce itself. There was no single moment. But the culture that had built itself from the ground up over the course of a decade was beginning to calcify in ways that would eventually hollow it out. The Japanese manufacturers had created something the custom builders had not fully anticipated, the universal Japanese motorcycle. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki were producing reliable, affordable, comfortable machines that required almost no maintenance knowledge from their riders. The CB750, the Z1, the GS750, these were not demanding machines. They did not need to be understood. They needed to be ridden. And that was genuinely appealing to a rider who wanted transportation rather than a project. The problem was not that those machines existed. The problem was what their dominance began to do to the relationship between rider and machine across the whole culture. When the average rider no longer needed to understand how the engine worked to keep it running, the average rider stopped learning. The deep mechanical knowledge that had characterized the working-class motorcycle community, the ability to diagnose by sound, to fabricate a part when the OEM part was unavailable, to solve a problem on the side of the road with what you had in your pocket, began to erode. Harley-Davidson's response to Japanese competition through the late 1970s was to lean harder into identity rather than engineering. You were not buying a Harley for its performance numbers, you were buying it for what it meant. That repositioning would eventually save the company after the 1981 management buyout from AMF and the extraordinary turnaround that followed, but it also completed the transformation of the Harley from working-class machine to something else. Something that cost more, required less mechanical engagement from its rider, and carried an increasingly expensive set of cultural associations that made it aspirational rather than accessible. A new 1976 Electra Glide was $3,375. Adjusted for real wage growth, that bike was still attainable for a working man who prioritized it. But the trajectory of Harley pricing from that point forward would take the flagship of American motorcycle manufacturing further and further from the working class rider who had been its natural constituency. The chopper era burned itself out around this time as well. The extreme machines that had defined the visual language of early 1970s motorcycle culture. Forks stretched to impossible lengths. Frames raked at angles that made handling genuinely difficult. Sissy bars reaching skyward had pushed the form as far as it could reasonably go. Riders who had been building for expression were ready for machines that were also actually practical. Disc brakes, electric starters, suspension that worked. The visual extremism of the early chopper era gave way to machines that were still custom, still individual, but were also rideable on a long highway day without your wrists aching. The custom builders who survived that transition were the ones who understood that the style had to serve the rider, not just make a statement. Arlen Ness understood this. His digger style had never sacrificed rideability for visual drama the way the extreme choppers had. The builders who had built purely for shock value found that shock value has a short shelf life. By 1980, when 40,000 riders arrived in Sturgis, a number that would have been unimaginable at the start of the decade, the rally was beginning to look less like a gathering of riders and more like an event. The vendors were multiplying. The entertainment was becoming a reason to attend in itself. The motorcycle was still there, still the central object, but it was sharing the stage with things that had nothing to do with riding. That is not a complaint. Growth is growth. But something in the texture of the community changed when it became large enough to be a market rather than just a culture. When the brands recognized that riders were a demographic with money to spend, the riders stopped being the people who built the culture and started being the people the culture was being built for. On February 26, 1981, 13 Harley-Davidson executives stood in a room in Milwaukee and signed papers that represented the most important bet in American manufacturing history. They had just borrowed $80 million to buy their own company back from AMF, the bowling equipment conglomerate that had owned Harley-Davidson since 1969 and had nearly destroyed it. The man leading the buyout was Vaughn Beals. The 13 men who signed included Willie G. Davidson, Harley's design chief and the grandson of the company's founder. They believed they could save the brand that had defined American motorcycle culture for 78 years. By the end of 1982, they were 6 weeks from bankruptcy. The Evolution engine, the Evo, had not yet arrived. The Shovelhead was still the machine, and the Shovelhead, after years of AMF production pressure, had a reputation that no amount of heritage marketing could fully overcome. A new Harley in 1982 had a documented reliability problem. It leaked oil. It needed attention. The Japanese manufacturers were producing machines that started every morning and required nothing beyond scheduled maintenance. Harley's market share in the super heavyweight category had fallen from 80% in 1969 to something closer to 15% by the early 1980s. At the exact moment Harley was fighting for its life, Kawasaki was building a motorcycle that would change everything again. The GPZ 900R, the first machine they would call the Ninja, had 16 valves, liquid cooling, an aerodynamic fairing, and a top speed of 115 miles per hour. A machine so far beyond anything that had preceded it in the sport category that its arrival in 1984 is the moment that separates the motorcycle world that existed from the motorcycle world that followed. The 1980s is the decade those two stories ran in parallel, the death and resurrection of the American iron tradition on one track, and the birth of the Japanese sport bike revolution on the other. They ran within miles of each other on American roads, served completely different riders for completely different reasons, and they have never fully shared the same cultural conversation since. This is the decade that split American motorcycle culture in two. The Harley-Davidson Evo engine, the Kawasaki Ninja, the sport bike revolution, the HOG Club that saved an American company, and the specific cost of everything that was done to survive. To understand what the 1980s Harley-Davidson resurrection actually was, you have to understand the full depth of the hole it was being dug out of. The AMF story is often told as simply a quality problem, and it was more than that. American Machine and Foundry purchased Harley-Davidson in 1969 for $21 million. AMF was not a motorcycle company. It was a conglomerate with product lines that included bowling equipment, golf equipment, industrial machinery, and recreational products. The acquisition made financial sense. The motorcycle market was exploding in the late 1960s, and Harley was the dominant American brand. AMF had capital and production expertise. Harley had brand equity and a manufacturing base. What AMF did with that combination was push production hard. The motorcycle market was growing, and they wanted to capture the growth. Before the AMF acquisition, Harley was producing approximately 16,000 motorcycles per year from its Milwaukee and York, Pennsylvania facilities. AMF pushed that number towards 75,000. Production nearly quadrupled in a period of a few years. The workforce could not maintain quality at that rate with the equipment and processes they had. Reports varied, but documentation from the period suggested that as many as a third of motorcycles leaving the factory had significant quality issues requiring dealer attention before delivery. Workers who had taken pride in building a machine to a standard found themselves on a line that prioritized speed over quality. The result was a 100-day strike in 1974. Workers who understood that the product they were being asked to build was not the product that Harley-Davidson's reputation had been built on walked out. The nicknames that riders gave AMF Harleys, like Hardly Drivable, Hogley Ferguson, and Hardly Abelson, were not affectionate. They were accurate descriptions from riders who had bought machines expecting the Harley reputation and received something that fell short. Harley's market share in the super heavyweight category collapsed not because the Japanese were better marketers, but because the Japanese were building better motorcycles. When 13 executives borrowed $80 million in February 1981 to buy the company back, they were not just buying a manufacturer, they were buying a broken production system, a damaged reputation, a demoralized workforce, and a brand whose name still meant something in the culture, but whose machines were being beaten in every measurable performance and reliability category by competitors who had been studying the American market for a decade. The specific thing those 13 men understood, that AMF had not, was this. Harley-Davidson was not a motorcycle company that had a brand. It was a culture that had a motorcycle company inside it. The machines could be made better. That was an engineering problem, solvable with investment and discipline. The culture was not replaceable at any price. And the culture was still alive in the garages of the riders who had stayed loyal through the AMF years, not because the machines were good, but because the identity was something they were not willing to surrender to a bowling equipment company. The Evolution engine arrived in 1984. The name was deliberate. Not a revolution, an evolution. The marketing emphasized continuity with the machines that had come before. The engineering told a more accurate story. The Evolution was an air-cooled V-twin displacing 80 cubic inches. In those dimensions, it resembled the shovelhead it replaced, but the resemblance was cosmetic. The Evo used aluminum alloy cylinders and heads rather than the iron of the shovelhead. The tolerances were tighter, the hydraulic valve adjusters were redesigned. The oil system was thoroughly reworked to address the chronic leaking that had made AMF-era Harleys notorious. The compression ratio was higher, producing more power from the same displacement. The result was a Harley-Davidson that started reliably, ran consistently, required dramatically less unscheduled maintenance, and could realistically be ridden across the country without the mechanical anxiety that riding a shovelhead had required. The comment left on the Evolution Buyer's Guide video, published 3 years ago and still actively receiving riders who want to document their machines, says everything your audience needs to hear about what the Evo meant. I bought 2 new Harleys in the early 1980s to help Harley stay afloat. That comment is from a rider who had the loyalty before the product justified it. The Evo was the product that finally justified the loyalty. The Evo's reliability was not just a quality improvement, it was a cultural restoration. The working-class rider who had built Harley's culture for 60 years had stayed through the MF disaster because the identity was real, even when the machines were not fully reliable. When the Evo arrived, the machines finally matched the identity. The riders who had been loyal through the bad years were rewarded not with a new brand, but with a machine that was finally worth the loyalty they had maintained. The 1984 Softail, introduced alongside the Evo engine, was the visual statement that completed the restoration. Willie G. Davidson had designed a frame that hid the rear suspension unit under the transmission, creating the visual lines of the hardtail frames of the 1950s and the 1960s while providing the ride quality that modern suspension delivered. The Softail looked like the past and rode like the present. It told the story the Harley-Davidson brand needed to tell. We know where we came from, we have not forgotten, and we are still here. I personally think the Softail was the most important single piece of motorcycle design of the 1980s. Not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced. The most important because it demonstrated that a manufacturer could draw a direct line from the culture's origin to the present without pretending the origin did not exist. In early 1982, Von Beals flew to Washington and asked the Reagan administration for a tariff on Japanese heavyweight motorcycles. The request was extraordinary for several reasons. Ronald Reagan was the most ideologically committed free market president in modern American history. His administration had been built on the principle that government intervention in markets produced worse outcomes than market competition. The idea of a tariff, a protectionist measure that taxed foreign goods to give domestic manufacturers a competitive advantage, was precisely the kind of government intervention that Reagan's economic philosophy rejected. Beals made the argument not as a request for protection, but as a request for time. Harley-Davidson did not need to be protected from Japanese competition forever. It needed 5 years to implement the quality improvements, the production changes, and the product development that would make it genuinely competitive. The tariff, which applied to Japanese motorcycles over 700 cubic centimeters, would give Harley the breathing room to complete the work without being buried by competitors who had the capital and production capacity to undercut on price while Harley was rebuilding. Reagan granted the tariff. A 45% duty on Japanese motorcycles over 700 cubic centimeters was imposed in 1983. The duty was scheduled to decrease annually and expire in 1988. The tariff worked. Japanese manufacturers responded partly by building manufacturing facilities in the United States and partly by engineering around the 700 cubic centimeter threshold, which produced some extraordinary machines, but that is a story for later. Harley used the breathing room to complete the Evo engine development, to implement the quality improvements that made the machines reliable, and to begin the brand repositioning that would eventually make the motorcycle the most recognizable American vehicle in the world. In 1987, a year before the tariff was scheduled to expire, Harley-Davidson asked the Reagan administration to lift it early. They no longer needed the protection. They were competitive. That is one of the most remarkable pieces of American industrial history of the 20th century. A company that had been 6 weeks from bankruptcy in 1982 asked for a protection measure, used it to rebuild, and voluntarily surrendered it before it expired because they no longer needed it. The tariff was not a crutch, it was a time machine that gave a dying American manufacturer the specific number of years it needed to become viable again. If you know someone who bought a Harley in the early 1980s when the machines were still fighting for their reputation, send them this video right now. The story of Von Beals flying to Washington, Reagan granting the tariff, and Harley voluntarily lifting it 5 years later because they no longer needed it is the most underdocumented piece of American manufacturing history in the last 50 years. Share this with your riding group, your family, anyone who has ever wondered how Harley-Davidson survived. This is the answer. The Harley Owners Group was founded in 1983. There were 33 original members. By 1985, it had 60,000 members. By 1990, it had 200,000 members. By 2000, it had 1 million members. The Hog was one of the most effective pieces of brand marketing in American corporate history. It was not a marketing program disguised as a community, or rather, it was exactly that. But the community it created was genuinely experienced as community by the people in it. The Hog organized rides. It connected riders across chapters. It provided the social infrastructure around the brand that the working class culture had previously provided organically. The specific demographic that the Harley Owners Group captured in the 1980s was the baby boomer generation reaching its peak earning years. Men who had been teenagers or young adults when Easy Rider was released in 1969 were now in their late 30s and 40s. They had money. They had the specific desire that a generation always has at that age to reconnect with the freedom and possibility they associated with their younger years. The Harley had become the symbol of American freedom for that generation, and it was exactly the object that served that reconnection. The Harley Owners Group boomer was not the working class rider who had built Harley's culture. He was the rider buying into a culture that working class men had built and that had been transformed into a premium, aspirational product during the AMF era. His machine was more reliable than AMF era bikes. It was also more expensive. Prices that had been climbing through the 1970s continued climbing through the 1980s. A new 1985 Electric Glide cost approximately $7,500, 3 times what a comparable machine had cost in 1970 in nominal dollars, and significantly more than that in real wage terms. The donut video that covers the Kawasaki Ninja story, 2.3 million views, and the highest performing 1980s motorcycle content on YouTube, contains a line that its comment section called the most honest thing ever said about this period. The line said that all those rebels without a car who made Harleys cool had gotten older and had started ruining the world. That is, entertainment writing with specific historical accuracy. The men who had made the Harley culturally powerful were the working class riders of the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. The men who were buying Harleys in the 1980s and the 1990s were largely their economic superiors, professionals not tradesmen, aspirational consumers, not working transportation riders. The Harley was not ruined by this transition. The company was saved by it. But the culture that had existed before the transition was transformed in ways that working class riders who had built it would have recognized as a trade they had not chosen to make. In January 1984, Kawasaki unveiled the GPZ 900R at the Cologne Motorcycle Show. They called it the Ninja. The machine had liquid cooling, the first Japanese sport bike to use it, because air cooling could not dissipate the heat generated by the engine Kawasaki had built. 16 valves in a 4-cylinder inline configuration, 95 horsepower at 9,500 revolutions per minute, a quarter-mile time of 11.6 seconds, a top speed of 149 miles per hour. The Kawasaki comment section captures what this machine meant to the riders who encountered it. Hondas are smooth, Suzukis are quick, Yamahas are fast, and Kawasaki's actively want you dead. That observation with 2,300 likes is not entirely ironic. The GPZ 900R was not a machine that forgave the rider who was not paying full attention. It was a machine that rewarded genuine skill and punished inadequate respect. The specific cultural significance of the Ninja for 1984 is the specific gap it created. Before the Ninja, the question of which motorcycle was fastest was a question with no clear answer. The answer depended on conditions, on rider weight, on specific configuration. After the Ninja, the answer was precise and documented. The Ninja was the fastest production motorcycle in the world. Not by a small margin, by a margin that the existing performance hierarchy had no response to. For riders under 35 in 1984, the Ninja was not a Harley alternative. It was a completely different proposition. It did not ask you to buy into a cultural identity. It asked you to demonstrate whether you could ride it. The machine was the credential. The community that formed around it was the community of people who could handle what it demanded. Top Gun arrived in 1986 with Tom Cruise on a GPZ 900R. The film is not a serious document of anything. But its cultural impact on the Ninja's visibility was significant. A generation of young American men watched the most celebrated action hero in popular cinema ride a specific motorcycle and understood that specific motorcycle as the thing that cool, skilled, physically capable men rode in 1986. The Ninja's American sales that year reflected the film's influence. The 1984 Buyer's Guide comment section gives you the Harley perspective on this period. Carbed Evo is HD's last good engine. HD Inc. chose to abandon it by obsoleting everything we need. RIP HD Inc. from 1903 to 1999. Evo's forever. The man who wrote that is not wrong about what the Evo represented. He is also not the same person as the man who bought a Ninja in 1984. These are two completely different riders with two completely different relationships to the machine, and the 1980s is the decade where the distance between them became permanent. The Kawasaki Ninja was not the end of the story, it was the opening move. Honda responded in 1984 with the VF750F Interceptor, and then in 1986 with the VFR 750F, a machine that refined the sport bike formula with Honda's characteristically engineering-obsessed approach. The VFR added gear-driven cams that produced a specific mechanical sound unlike any other motorcycle engine, a high-frequency whine that became the signature of the machine and that riders who owned them still describe with specific nostalgia. The VFR was not the fastest machine of its era, it was the best sorted. The machine could be ridden quickly every day without demanding the rider's complete attention for survival. Suzuki produced the GSX R750 in 1985, a machine built around the specific philosophy of removing everything that was not necessary for speed. The GSX-R was lighter than the GP's 900R despite comparable power. It had a monoshock rear suspension that Suzuki had developed from their endurance racing program. It had fully floating brake discs that had been proven in competition. It looked like a race bike because it was built from race bike engineering applied to a production machine. The 1980s sport bike competition between Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Yamaha was the most concentrated period of genuine motorcycle engineering advancement in American history. Each new machine was faster, lighter, better braked, and better suspended than its predecessor. Each raised the performance floor for the category, and the riders who bought these machines were participating in an escalation whose endpoint nobody was managing. The performance gap between what the machines could do and what the average young American rider had the skill to manage was growing with each generation. The Ninja could reach 149 miles per hour. The rider who bought a Ninja at 22 years old and had been riding for 2 years was not capable of using 149 miles per hour safely. The machine's capability was not the rider's capability. And that gap, which would widen through the 1990s as the machines became even more capable, was not a problem the manufacturers were motivated to solve. More capability sold machines. The consequences of selling machines to riders who could not handle their capability were consequences that the riders and their families bore, not the manufacturers. By the mid-1980s, two completely distinct motorcycle cultures were operating simultaneously on American roads. The Harley culture, rebuilt around the Evo engine, and the Hog, with its rally events, its organized rides, and a specific aesthetic of chrome and leather, and the big twin V-twin sound, was attracting the baby boomer demographic that was now the dominant consumer force in the American economy. These riders were in their late 30s and 40s. They were buying Harleys as a statement about identity, heritage, and the freedom they associated with a youth they were reconnecting with through a premium consumer product. The sport bike culture, GPZ 900R, VFR 750, GSX-R, with its aerodynamic fairings and racing-derived performance and a completely different aesthetic of speed rather than tradition, was attracting younger riders. They were men in their 20s who were not interested in heritage, who were not buying an identity, who were buying the fastest thing available, and trying to figure out whether they could handle it. These two cultures shared American roads, but they did not share a conversation. The Harley rider and the sport bike rider in 1986 had essentially nothing in common beyond being on two wheels. Their machines were built for different purposes, maintained through different practices, ridden in different styles, and valued for different reasons. The two-lane road in 1986 might have a Harley Road King on one side and a Kawasaki Ninja on the other. Both riders waved at each other. They did not understand each other. That moment, that specific mutual incomprehension on the American highway, is where the split in motorcycle culture that would define everything afterward became permanent. Not hostile, not overtly adversarial. Simply separate. Two cultures that had emerged from the same machine had arrived at completely different places and were now moving in completely different directions. The working class knowledge culture that had built American motorcycling through the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s was being squeezed from both sides. The Harley culture was pricing out the working class rider. The sport bike culture was technically accessible but demanded a kind of performance competence that the old wrench culture approach to motorcycle knowledge did not prepare you for. The story of these two cultures running parallel through the 1980s and never quite finding a common language. That is the story every motorcycle rider in America has felt, but nobody has told clearly. If you know someone who rode in the 1980s, whether they were a Harley rider or a sport bike rider, or someone who remembers both cultures from opposite sides, share this video with them. Post it anywhere riders talk about what motorcycles were and what they became. This is the history that explains the split every rider still feels when they pull up next to a machine completely unlike their own. By 1989, Harley-Davidson had completed one of the most remarkable corporate turnarounds in American history. Market share in the super heavyweight category had recovered significantly. The waiting list for new Harleys, a phenomenon that would have been unimaginable in 1981, existed and was growing. The Hog had become the most successful owner community in motorcycle history. The tariff had been lifted early. The Evo was being praised by riders and mechanics for the reliability that the Shovelhead had never consistently achieved. What had been traded to get there was the working-class accessibility that had defined Harley's relationship with its core riders for 60 years. A new 1989 Harley-Davidson Softail Custom cost approximately $9,000. The median American family income in 1989 was approximately $34,000. The motorcycle that had cost a factory worker 3 months of gross income in 1972 now cost a factory worker nearly 3 months of gross income, in nominal terms similar. But the product had been repositioned. The buyer was no longer expected to be a factory worker. The buyer was expected to be a professional, the aspirational consumer, the man who wanted the symbol of working class freedom without the working class income that had originally produced it. The sport bike side of the decade ended with machines that were genuinely dangerous in the specific way that high-performance machinery is dangerous when it exceeds the competence of the average rider. The GSX R1100 arrived in 1986. The Kawasaki ZX-10 arrived in 1988. The Honda CBR1000F arrived in 1987. Each of these machines had power outputs and top speeds that the manufacturers were starting to acknowledge, at least internally, exceeded what most riders needed or could safely use. The performance war continued anyway, because performance sold machines, and the machines that performance sold were generating revenues that no manufacturer was willing to sacrifice to a safety argument. The 1980s ended with American motorcycle culture split in a way it had never been split before. Not between outlaws and straights, as in the 1950s, not between working class riders and the counterculture, as in the 1960s, between two completely distinct communities that had each developed internally coherent cultures and aesthetics and values, and that had almost no common vocabulary with each other. Both communities were real. Both produced genuine riders. Both had their own versions of the knowledge culture. The Harley mechanic who understood every aspect of the evolution engine was as competent in his domain as the sport bike rider who could carry corner speed through a canyon road at the limit of the machine's capability. But the culture that had unified all of American motorcycle riding, the working class culture of the machine as a practical and honest tool, understandable by anyone willing to pay attention, was no longer the center of what American motorcycling was. It had become one option among several. In 1992, two things happened in American motorcycle culture that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with each other. In Long Beach, California, a former bodyguard named Jesse James, who had spent the late 1980s protecting Soundgarden and Slayer on tour, founded West Coast Choppers in his mother's garage. No loans, no partners, hand tools, a welder, and the specific conviction that a motorcycle could be built to a standard the factory would never match. He built a machine at night and sold fenders during the day for $750 a week to pay the bills. The first WCC chopper was not a product. It was a statement of principle. That same year, Honda released the CBR 900RR Fireblade in America. Designed by Tadao Baba, who had spent years arguing inside Honda's engineering culture for a machine that achieved superbike power in a 600cc class chassis, 893cc, 122 horsepower, a weight of 185 kilograms, lighter than the Honda CBR 600 of the era it competed against. The Fireblade did not announce itself with advertising or celebrity clients. It announced itself by doing something no production motorcycle had done before. It made the performance of a factory race bike available to anyone who could afford it and survive it. Jesse James in his mother's garage, Tadao Baba's Fireblade at your local Honda dealer. Those two things running simultaneously in 1992 are the entire 1990s motorcycle story. The culture that had split in the 1980s between the Harley identity world and the sport bike performance world did not reconcile in the 1990s. It separated further. It developed different languages, different heroes, different values, different relationships to the machine. And by the end of the decade, when Harley's Hog membership had crossed 1 million and the Yamaha R1 had redefined what a production sport bike could be, the two cultures occupied the same roads and shared almost no common vocabulary. I'm Jimmy. This is the decade the split became permanent. The Honda CBR 900RR Fireblade, the Yamaha YZF R1, the Kawasaki ZX9R, Jesse James and West Coast Choppers, the Harley Fatboy and Terminator 2, Hog membership at 1 million, motorcycle fatalities climbing, and the specific moment when American motorcycle culture stopped being one thing and became two things that have not found their way back to each other since. The 1990s Harley-Davidson story begins in 1990 with the introduction of the FLSTF Fat Boy, a machine whose design pulled from the visual language of the 1940s and 1950s more deliberately than anything Harley had produced in decades. Solid disc wheels, a wide glide front end, a fat, low profile that communicated mass and deliberateness rather than the lean aggression of a sport machine. The Fat Boy was not subtle. It was designed to be looked at. On July 3, 1991, Terminator 2: Judgment Day opened in American cinemas. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most physically imposing screen presence in Hollywood, rode a Harley-Davidson Fat Boy through the film's most iconic chase sequence. The motorcycle did not play a supporting role, it played a lead. The image of Schwarzenegger on the Fat Boy, shotgun in one hand, navigating the Los Angeles drainage canal at speed while a 10-ton truck pursued him, was the motorcycle image that entered the American popular imagination in 1991 and stayed there. Sales of the Fat Boy after Terminator 2 were not coincidental. The Harley-Davidson of 1990 was not the Harley-Davidson of 1981. The buyout decade had produced the Evolution engine, the soft-tail frame, the hog, and a brand repositioning that had transformed the motorcycle from a working-class transportation tool into the most powerful status object in the American premium consumer market. A new Fat Boy in 1990 cost $10,000. That price point did not exclude the working-class rider, but it included, deliberately, the professional class rider who was now the primary growth demographic. The baby boomers were in their 40s, the generation that had grown up with Easy Rider, that had watched the chopper era, that had not themselves necessarily ridden, but had understood motorcycles as the symbols of freedom that their generation valued. These men now had the disposable income to buy the symbol. And the Harley-Davidson Fat Boy after Terminator 2 was the most recognizable motorcycle symbol in the history of American popular culture. The HOG, the Harley Owners Group, founded in 1983 with 33 members, had grown through the mid-80s and continued through the 1990s in a way that no one had projected. The specific number that matters, HOG had 200,000 members in 1990. It had 1 million members by 2000. The largest single brand owner organization in the history of the motorcycle industry grew 5 times over in a single decade. That growth was not organic in the way that working class motorcycle culture had grown organically. Through need, through mechanical interest, through the specific attraction of people who genuinely wanted to ride. It was marketing-driven growth, aspirational consumer growth, the growth of a lifestyle brand that happened to have a machine at its center. I personally think the distinction between organic cultural growth and marketing-driven aspirational growth matters enormously for understanding what happened to motorcycle culture in the 1990s. The riders who came to Harley through the HOG in the 1990s were not bad riders or illegitimate riders. They were people who genuinely valued what the machine represented, but they valued representation. They valued the symbol, and a culture that grows primarily through the attraction of symbol seekers rather than machine understanders changes in ways that the people who built it on mechanical competence can feel even when they cannot fully name. Tadao Baba spent years inside Honda's engineering organization arguing for a machine that should not have been possible. The motorcycle world of the late 1980s operated on an established understanding. A superbike, a machine producing superbike power, was large and heavy. The power required a large engine. The large engine required a large chassis. The large chassis required a heavy structure. These were not arbitrary limitations. They were engineering realities that everyone building sport bikes accepted as constraints. Baba did not accept them. His specific argument was this: the limiting factor in a street-ridden sport bike is not power output. It is total system weight. A motorcycle that weighs less can accelerate faster with the same power, stop shorter with the same brakes, and change direction more quickly with the same suspension. If you could achieve superbike power in a machine that weighed what a middleweight weighed, you would have something that could outperform a superbike in every real-world condition. The CBR 900RR that arrived in 1992 was the proof of that argument. 893 cubic centimeters, not the full liter that convention expected. 122 horsepower, and a curb weight that undercut every machine in its performance class by a significant margin. The Fireblade was smaller than its competitors, more compact. When riders first encountered it at dealers, the consistent response was, It looked smaller than it should be. The wheelbase was shorter than a CBR 600. The machine that was competing with leader bikes could be mistaken, standing still, for something with considerably less displacement. On the road, the Fireblade was not forgiving. The compact chassis, the short wheelbase, the responsive steering geometry, these characteristics produced a machine that required genuine skill to use at its limits. The comment from the late break show's Fireblade video, 332,000 views, says what riders who owned early blades consistently say, "I remember when the Fireblade came out, it was such a radical game changer at the time." Another rider, "The old blade is one of the absolute best looking street bikes ever made. The colors, the holes in the fairing, the dual headlight, gorgeous." A third, "My 1998 Fireblade still delivers in spades on real roads." These are not nostalgic generalities, they are specific technical appreciations from riders who understand what made the machine exceptional. The Fireblade's genius was not that it was fast. Many machines were fast. Its genius was that it was fast and light and handled, that it achieved the combination of qualities that serious riders actually needed on real roads. The gap between what the Fireblade could do and what the average buyer could safely access was, however, real and growing. A machine producing 122 horsepower in a chassis weighing 185 kilograms does not manage the mistakes of an inexperienced rider. It amplifies them. The rider who bought a Fireblade in 1992 at 22 years old, with 2 years of riding experience behind him, was not insufficiently talented, he was insufficiently experienced for what the machine demanded. By the mid-1990s, motorcycle fatality data was telling a story that the manufacturers and the industry press were not telling. Motorcycle deaths in the United States had declined through the mid-1980s, partly because of the safety culture that the MSF had been building since its founding in 1973, and partly because the machines of that era, while fast by the standards of their time, were not as exponentially capable as what was coming. Through the 1990s, the fatality data began showing specific patterns. The sport bike category, the machines in the CBR 900RR class, and the ZX9R class, and the GSXR 1100R class was producing a disproportionate share of fatal accidents relative to the number of machines in service. Younger riders. Shorter riding histories. Machines with power-to-weight ratios that exceeded the competence of the average new rider. The specific dynamic was not complicated. A new rider at 22 could walk into a dealership, put down a deposit on a CBR 900RR, and ride away on a machine producing 122 horsepower. Nothing in the purchase process asked him to demonstrate the competence that machine required. Nothing in the dealer's interest was served by suggesting that a different machine might be more appropriate. The MSF Basic Rider Course, an excellent program that taught fundamental motorcycle operation, could be completed in a weekend. The skills it certified were the skills needed to operate a motorcycle safely at legal speeds on empty roads. They were not the skills needed to use 122 horsepower safely in traffic. I personally think this is the most important and least discussed fact about the 1990s motorcycle culture. The performance gap, the space between what the machines could produce and what the average rider who purchased them could safely use, was widening with every model year. And the manufacturers were not slowing the escalation because escalation sold machines. The fatality data did not cause the manufacturers to limit performance. It caused insurers to limit coverage. Young male riders on high-displacement sport bikes faced insurance premiums that reflected the actuarial reality, even when the cultural conversation around the machines refused to. If you know someone who rode in the 1990s, whether on a sport bike or a Harley, whether they are still riding or whether they lost someone to the performance gap that nobody was talking about, honestly, share this video with them. The story of what was actually happening in 1990s motorcycle culture behind the Terminator, Too Fat Boy, and the Fireblade brochure has never been told this directly. Share it with your riding group, your family and friends, anyone who wants to understand where the culture they love actually came from. Every share puts this history in front of someone who needs it. If the Fireblade was the opening argument of the 1990 SE Sport bike era, the Yamaha YZF R1 of 1998 was its conclusion. The ZX9R arrived from Kawasaki in 1994 as their response to the Fireblade, a machine that matched the Honda in the compact chassis with high power formula while adding Kawasaki's specific character. The machines were competing not just for sales, but for the specific honor of being the fastest production motorcycle in the world. That honor moved with each model year update. Suzuki's GSX-R evolved. Honda updated the Fireblade. Kawasaki updated the Ninja line. The competitive iteration compressed the development cycle in ways that peacetime engineering normally does not experience. In 1998, Yamaha produced a machine that the motorcycle press described in terms that sounded like hyperbole until you read the specification sheet. The YZF R1 produced 150 horsepower from a 998cc inline 4 engine. It weighed 177 kilograms, lighter than the Fireblade it was competing with. The power-to-weight ratio was closer to a racing machine than anything that had previously been sold through a street motorcycle dealer. The R1 did to the late 1990 S sport bike world what the Ninja had done to the early 1980 S sport bike world. It created a before and an after. The machines that preceded it were suddenly measurably slower. The manufacturers who had spent the decade incrementally improving their products were now facing a step-change competitor that reset the performance floor. The comment on the Suzuki GSX-R history video, 1.36 million views, 811 comments, captures what riders who lived through this period felt. The Japanese build the best motorcycles on the planet, 40 years ago and still today. Those of us that love and have had the honor to experience riding on such affordable, well-made motorcycles owe the Japanese a huge thank you. Another rider, I started on a 1988 GSX R750. Mine was a year old, and I was 20. I'll never forget it. Best time of my life. That last comment contains the entire 1990s sport bike experience in 2 sentences. Started young, on a machine a year older than the current model, making it slightly more accessible. Never forgot it. The best time of his life. That description. Young, capable machine. Formative experience was not confined to one rider. It describes a generation. What the comment does not say, because the comment is about gratitude and memory, not about the people who did not make it, is what the fatality statistics document. The generation that had the best time of their lives on 1990s sport bikes was also the generation that lost more of its members per mile ridden than any previous generation in motorcycle history. Both things are true. The machines were extraordinary. The gap between what they could do and what their average rider could safely use was real and had real consequences. The 1990s was the decade that produced both of those truths simultaneously and never resolved the tension between them. While the Japanese manufacturers were waging the performance war, Jesse James was doing something in Long Beach that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with what performance had abandoned. West Coast Choppers, founded in 1992 in his mother's garage, initially selling t-shirts and stickers to fund the machine building perhaps 12 to 15 choppers per year at prices that started at $50,000, was the opposite of what the sport bike world represented. Where the sport bikes were about measurable, documented, track-tested performance, the WCC chopper was about something that no dynamometer could measure. It was about the relationship between the builder and the machine, made visible in the specific choices of every fabricated component. Jesse James learned fabrication from Boyd Coddington, the legendary hot rod builder who had himself built a culture around the idea that a machine could be entirely handmade, that every component could be the product of specific human skill rather than factory production. From Coddington, James took the fundamental principle. The maker understands the object completely because the maker produced every part of it. There is no black box. There is no component whose function is unknown. The machine is an extension of the builder's knowledge. The WCC chopper of the early 1990s was not a Harley-Davidson product with aftermarket parts. It was a machine built from the ground up, using a Harley's mechanical components as raw material and the builder's vision as the actual determinant of what the final object was. Extended front forks, hand-fabricated tanks, rigid frames. The aesthetic was deliberately stripped, deliberately aggressive, deliberately opposite to the chrome and leather comfort orientation of the HOG Boomer Harley. Jesse James in his mother's garage in 1992 was doing what Arlen Ness had done in his San Leandro garage in 1963. Taking the available materials, applying the available skill, building something that had not existed before. The difference was the decade. Ness had built in a decade when the working class motorcycle culture was still the dominant frame. James was building in a decade when the HOG had 500,000 members and growing, when the Harley had become a premium aspirational product, when the working class origin of the custom culture was being rapidly gentrified into a lifestyle category. The specific irony, which would become clear in the 2000s Sissy when West Coast choppers became a television phenomenon, is that Jesse James's garage work, done in opposition to the commercialization of motorcycle culture, would itself become the seed of the most commercially successful custom motorcycle operation of the early 21st century. The opposition to the brand became the brand. The culture that rejected the lifestyle category became the most visible lifestyle category available. That irony was still invisible in 1992. The machine in the garage was just the machine in the garage. Sturgis in the 1990s was the barometer of everything that was happening to American motorcycle culture simultaneously. In 1990, approximately 100,000 riders came to Sturgis. By 1995, attendance had grown significantly. By 1999, the end of the decade, attendance was routinely approaching 500,000 in peak years, making it the largest annual motorcycle gathering on Earth by a margin that no other event came close to matching. Those attendance numbers contained both of the 1990s stories in one place. The Harley boomer riding in on a fat boy with his hog patch. The sport bike rider who had driven the canyon roads of South Dakota at speeds that the South Dakota Highway Patrol noted with professional concern. The independent custom builders who'd been coming since the decade when 3,000 riders attended and camped in the city park. The Vietnam veterans who had been coming since before the hog existed, who remembered what it had been and watched what it was becoming. Sturgis in the 1990s was not hostile to any of these communities. It was the specific place where they all shared the same geography for 10 days each August without sharing the same culture. The Harley boomer and the sport bike rider and the independent builder and the Vietnam veteran were all at Sturgis. They camped in different areas. They gathered at different venues. They rode different roads at different speeds for different reasons. They waved at each other on the highways because that was the protocol of the motorcycle world. They did not necessarily understand what the wave meant to the person on the other side of it. The Black Hills Motor Classic had been founded by Pappy Howell in 1938 with 9 racers and 200 spectators and weenies for lunch in a tent behind a garage. By the mid-1990s, the event that Pappy had turned over to the city of Sturgis in the 1980s was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual economic activity for South Dakota. The racing, the flat track, and the hill climb that had been the original reason for the gathering was still happening at the Jack Pine Gypsies track. But the racing was buried under concerts and vendor markets and commercial infrastructure that had grown to match the attendance. The Jack Pine Gypsies still ran the track. The race was still the heart. But you had to know where the heart was to find it under everything that had grown around it. By the mid-1990s, the two cultures that had split in the 1980s had become so distinct that the question of what connected them, beyond the basic fact of 2 wheels and an engine, was genuinely difficult to answer. The Harley world of the 1990s was organized around community, identity, heritage, and the specific emotional resonance of a brand that had survived near death and come back as something that felt more American than any other product in the consumer market. The HOG gave its members events, organized rides, a magazine, a community structure that did everything a club had traditionally done, but with the corporate backing of the manufacturer whose machine the club was organized around. For a baby boomer who had never belonged to an AMA-sanctioned club and had not grown up in the working-class motorcycle community, the HOG was genuinely welcoming. It asked nothing except membership dues and the purchase of a Harley. The sport bike world of the 1990s was organized around performance, technical competence, speed, and the specific culture of riders who wanted to test themselves against what the machine could do. The track days that were becoming a feature of American motorcycle culture through the 1990s organized sessions at road racing circuits where riders could explore their machine's performance in a controlled environment, were the sport bike community's equivalent of the HOG organized ride. But track days asked something different. They asked the rider to demonstrate competence. They sorted for skill in a way that membership dues did not. These two organizing principles, community and membership versus performance and competence, produced different kinds of riders and different relationships to the machine. Neither was wrong. Both were real. But they were not the same thing, and the culture that had built American motorcycling on the shared foundation of mechanical knowledge that both kinds of rider needed to develop was losing its ability to serve as that common foundation. The working class rider who had built the culture, who had maintained his own shovelhead, who had rebuilt his carburetors and set his own points and diagnosed oil leaks by location, was still out there. He was in his 50s now. He recognized the Harley HOG boomer and the sport bike kid both as motorcyclists and both as people who had found something real in the machine. He also recognized that neither of them was inheriting the specific knowledge culture he had been part of. The HOG had a dealer service department for that. The sport bike had become reliable enough that it did not demand the attention a shovelhead had demanded. I personally think the 1990s is the decade when the question, what does it mean to be a real rider, became genuinely contested in a way it had not been before. Not because anyone new to the culture was wrong to want to participate, but because the culture no longer had a single answer to give them. The question of what connects these two worlds, the Harley HOG culture and the sport bike culture, is the question every rider on American roads is still living with. If you know someone on the other side of that divide from you, a Harley rider who has never understood why anyone would want a sport bike, or a sport bike rider who has never understood why anyone would want a Harley, share this video with them. The history of how that divide formed is the beginning of understanding it. Post it in your writing group, send it to family and friends. The conversation that motorcycle culture never finished having in the 1990s is worth starting now. By 1999, the decade had produced its verdict. The Harley Hog culture was the most commercially successful motorcycle phenomenon in American history. 1 million members, waiting lists for new machines, a brand that had gone from 15% market share in its category in the early 1980s to a position of dominance achieved not through performance competition, but through cultural authority. The Harley had become the American motorcycle, not because it was the fastest or the most reliable or the most technologically advanced, but because it carried the specific cultural weight of American freedom, working class heritage, and the specific romance of the open road that no amount of Japanese engineering could replicate in the American popular imagination. The sport bike world had produced a performance war that ended the decade with the Yamaha R1, 150 horsepower, 177 kilograms, a machine whose specifications would have been science fiction in 1984 when the first Ninja arrived. The performance escalation had created machines of extraordinary capability that the average young American rider could purchase but not always safely use. The fatality data was real, the competence gap was real, and the performance war was not over. The machines that would arrive in the early 2000s would make the R1 look conservative. Jesse James was still in Long Beach, still building 12 to 15 choppers per year by hand, still operating in the underground between the two worlds that were dominating the cultural conversation. He would not become famous until 2000, when the Discovery Channel made him the subject of a documentary, the most watched show in Discovery Channel history at that time. The seed that had been planted in his mother's garage in 1992 was about to flower in ways that would transform the custom chopper from an underground culture into the dominant motorcycle aesthetic of the early 2000s. But that is a story for the next decade. What the 1990s left behind was the question that neither the hog culture nor the sport bike culture had answered. What is the thing that connects all riders to each other beyond the basic fact of two wheels? What is the shared foundation when the knowledge requirements have been relaxed, When the community has been organized by marketing, as well as by genuine affinity, when the machines have become so capable that the gap between what they can do and what their average rider can safely do has become a documented social problem. The riders who know the answer to that question are still out there. They are the ones who maintain their own machines, who understand every system, who can diagnose by sound and feel and smell in addition to the diagnostic code reader. They are in every corner of the culture: Harley garages and sport bike communities and independent builder shops. They are the foundation under the surface that the 1990s made more visible than any decade before it. The surface and the foundation. The 1960s separated them. The 1990s put the widest distance between them of any decade. And the question of whether they can ever fully close that distance again is the question that American motorcycle culture is still trying to answer.